Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome everyone to the BAA. My name is Heike Paul, and I have the honor to open tonight's program. Biden won, now what? Is the title of tonight's talk, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, Kerry Haynie, Professor of Political Science and African American Studies, who has agreed to provide an answer to this question and to offer us and discuss with us his undoubtedly well-informed view on current developments and trends in US politics. Kerry Haynie is a long-time partner of the BAA, and he has been the host of numerous BAA fellows. In fact, since 1.5 decades, we have been cooperating, and we are very grateful to our colleague for this very strong and very dedicated collaboration. Professor Haynie is chair of political science at the Trinity College of Arts and Science at Duke University since 2021, but had joined Duke already in 2003 as associate professor and later as associate chair of political science. From 2010 to 13, he was also associate professor as well as a faculty co-director in the Department of African and African American Studies and at the Center for Race, Ethnicity, and Gender in the Social Sciences. From 2019 to 21, he served as chair of Duke's Academic Council, the Faculty Senate at Duke University. Before he came to Duke in 2003, Professor Haynie was a member of the faculty at Rutgers University, the State University of New Jersey, and the University of Pennsylvania. In his research, Professor Haynie's focus is on the interplay between race and gender with respect to politics. This includes, for example, questions such as how do race and gender affect who is elected and represented, what policies are prioritized by members of specific groups, for example, by African American women legislators, and another big question, what difference does diversity in representation actually make? The intersectionality of race and gender is at the center of his most recent monograph, Race, Gender, and Legislative Representation Toward a More Intersectional Approach. And he is the author together with Beth Reingold and Kirsten Whitner. The book was published in 2020 by Oxford University Press, and it was awarded the 2021 Richard F. Fenno Jr. Prize from the American Political Science Association for Best Book in Legislative Studies. Now, besides numerous articles in academic journals, other publications include his classic, his monograph, African American Legislators in the American States, which was published by Columbia UP. And here, Professor Haynie examined the dynamics and effectiveness of Black participation in the legislative process by analyzing the behavior of African American state legislators and the challenges they face of being both legislators on the one hand and race representatives on the other. Our guest tonight is also the co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Minorities in American Politics, published in 2000, and of New Race Politics in America, Understanding Minority and Immigrant Politics from 2008, published by Cambridge. He is a dedicated university teacher and mentor. I already indicated that it is also for the BAA that he is doing this kind of a mentorship or has this mentor role. At his own institution, he is founder and director of the Summer Institute on Tenure and Professional Advancement, a junior faculty mentoring initiative. And last but not least, let me say that Professor Haynie is a much sought after political analyst who regularly contributes to various media outlets. We are glad that he can join us on this forum tonight to share his expertise And we welcome you, Professor Kerry Haynie. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Paul, for that very generous introduction. I'm happy to be with you. I only wish it was in person, but here we are still in the midst of this persistent pandemic, and we need to stay safe and do these things in a wise way. So I'm happy to be among my friends at the America House in the Amerika-Akademie. And again, as Professor Paul mentioned, it's been a long partnership. One that's been mutually beneficial. So what I want to do tonight is to talk about the election of Donald Trump and then the transition to the Biden administration and ponder this question. So what now that Joe Biden has been elected and Donald Trump has exited the scene? And let me just start by saying that there's no question that Donald Trump's election as president of the United States shocked the American political system. And his presidency and his administration rattled global politics. From the EU to Africa, the Trump administration was unsettling for allies and foes alike. But the question, was Trump an aberration? That is, was his election and his administration, as many political observers have concluded, a radical departure from what had come in the US before? I think the answers to those questions are yes and no, but mostly no. Yes and no, but mostly no. Let me say that my observations and reflections tonight are on US domestic politics. I'm focused on US domestic politics. With regards to US foreign policy and foreign engagement in world affairs during the Trump administration, Trump clearly was an aberration, but that's a talk for another day. When it comes to US domestic politics, the answer is less clear and less definitive. I think Donald Trump is best viewed as the manifestation of at least a 50-year effort by members of the Republican Party to take over and reorient American politics by almost any means necessary. Let me use as an example of this effort to reorient American politics the efforts by former Republican member of Congress, former Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich's efforts to move the Republican Party into the majority in the House back in the late 1970s. What Gingrich did back then laid the groundwork for Trump's emergence in 2015. In the late 1970s, Gingrich, then a junior member of Congress, pioneered a style of politics that was combative and included name-calling, conspiracy theories, and the strategic destruction of longstanding norms and practices in the House of Representatives. The objective was to propel the Republican Party into the majority in the Congress. The Republican Party then was at a very low point in its history in Congress. Keep in mind, in 1978, many Republicans, this was right after the Watergate scandal, and Republicans had taken a beating in American elections in the years after that scandal. So Gingrich recruited a cadre of young bomb throwers to join him in this effort to regain control of the Congress for his party. This group was not very much interested in legislating. Instead, they set out to take over their own party first, and then to take over the Congress itself. A main tactic of this group was to reframe routine policy debates in Washington as us versus them, urban versus rural, and as Washington versus the rest of us. So when you reframe politics in this fashion, it's easy then to turn simple, ordinary political issues into wedge issues that play well in the press and play well among ordinary constituents. This was the project that Gingrich and his colleagues undertook. And what they did worked. Gingrich and his gang took over the GOP, and Gingrich eventually rose to become Speaker of the House of Representatives. They succeeded by practicing a politics that split the Republican Party internally. It weakened Congress as an institution. They politicized the courts and other institutions, and they fractured America's political culture and plunged Washington into permanent dysfunction. Now, we can draw a direct line from Gingrich's so-called Republican Revolution to the rise of the Tea Party some 15 or 20 years later, and also to the rise of Donald Trump as a major political figure. So Donald Trump was not an aberration. He was a continuation and a manifestation of a larger trend in Republican Party politics. Stirring up inter-party conflict and turmoil, attacking political institutions, and demonizing opponents are not new, and they did not begin with Donald Trump. They have long been features in American politics. Now, this trend goes much farther back than the Newt Gingrich years, but I think that illustration is a good example and a good illustration for my argument that I want to make this evening. Now, there are some ways that Trump was aberrant. That he actually won might be one of them. No one expected Donald Trump to win. I don't think Donald Trump himself expected to win the election. Although I tend to believe that it was more of a case that Hillary Clinton lost than Donald Trump won. Hillary Clinton ran a very poor campaign for president. She assumed the coalition that Barack Obama put together would naturally and automatically show up and support her without her having to work for and ask for that support. Let me give you an example. Here where I am now in Durham, North Carolina, it's a majority Black city. In 2008, when Barack Obama was running for president, and again in 2012, I saw, numerous yard signs and political campaign signs all over the city. My barbershop, I would go to my barbershop and he had an entire wall with Barack Obama posters and banners, both in 2008 and 2012. In 2016, in that same barbershop, not one Hillary Clinton banner or poster, not one. Traveling around Durham, the city, very few Clinton yard signs and political posters. I called my barber and I said, Joe, why no Clinton signs? I think you're a Democrat. And he laughed and said, I'm a Democrat. He said, all of those Obama signs I put up because someone brought them to me and asked me to put them up. And in 2016, not one person asked this barbershop to put up a Clinton poster or campaign sign. And I should say my barbershop, where it's located in Durham, is just a few blocks from an historically Black university, a large voting bloc that would support Clinton if asked and mobilized. But in 2016, there was very little effort, or not enough effort, I should say, to mobilize the Black vote and Latino vote. The Clinton campaign assumed that Obama's winning coalition would support her automatically and without much work. So I think Hillary lost more than Trump won in 2016. Trump may be aberrant because of some personality traits and some oddities regarding his demeanor and his behavior. So I will grant that, and grant that easily, that he was an odd duck, is an odd duck, and unusual as a major political figure in the United States because of his oddities. He was certainly aberrant because of his propensity to say out loud what others would only whisper. He would say out loud what others would only whisper. And here I'm referring to the xenophobia, the racial dog whistles, and the sexism that Trump had no problem articulating any and everywhere. What Trump was willing to vocalize with a bullhorn is what other politicians before him would routinely communicate via subtle dog whistles. In this sense, Trump is not an aberration, but is a continuation of a long trend in American politics, not a deviation from it. The content of the messages were not different, only the manner in which they were delivered. Let me give you a quick example. American presidential politics have long been influenced by race baiting and the politics of racial divisiveness. In modern elections, such efforts have been meticulously designed and strategically targeted. In the 1960s, the Southern strategy was the name given to Republican Party efforts to win elections in the South by playing on racial fears and the resentments of whites who were disaffected by the Democratic Party's embrace of civil rights for African Americans. Richard Nixon popularized the Southern strategy in his campaign for president in 1968. 1968, long before Donald Trump is on the political scene. The Southern strategy calls for campaigns to incite racial animus among whites through the use of code words and wedge issues, with the goal of increasing white voter turnout for Republican candidates. In their early usage, the appeals were overtly racialized, but over time, they have become much less so, relying instead on abstract and subtle symbolic cues. Lee Atwater, the campaign manager for the successful presidential campaign of George Herbert Walker Bush, describes it this way. Now, before I read this quote from Atwater, let me apologize in advance for the offensive language included in the quote, but my reciting it is necessary to make my point. So I apologize in advance. Atwater said in a publication about the Southern strategy, you start out in 1954 by saying, nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, it backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting so abstract. Now, in the 1980s, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all the things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is Blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this as much more abstract, and even the busing thing, and hell, of a lot more abstract than nigger, 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 end quote. So what Atwater is saying, and what he is describing, is a long-standing trend in practice of race baiting and dog whistles in American politics that long preceded Donald Trump. The tactic changed over time from being overt to subtle, and more subtle as we go on, because it backfires to be so overtly racist and sexist and xenophobic in American politics. But there's some advantage to be had by being so subtly. Since the 1980s, the Southern strategy abstractions have expanded to include references to growing Latino presence in the South and elsewhere. Words and phrases like illegal aliens, illegal immigration, border security, build the wall, and voter fraud are now routinely used in elections and campaigns as code words similar to what is described by Atwater in the quote I just read. Now, Donald Trump adopted and mastered pre-existing examples and models. He didn't create anything new in his behavior. He adopted and mastered pre-existing examples. The politics that Trump and those who came before him practiced were fashioned in response to some trends in American politics that have Republicans worried, and for good reason. There's some demographic trends in the US that threaten the Republican Party as a competitive national political party. And let me say a word about these demographic trends. African Americans, Latinos are becoming a large share of the voting electorate, a larger share. Sizable majorities of both of these groups align with and support the Democratic Party. The population growth among these groups threatened the viability of the Republican Party as a national party. And as a result, the Republican Party has undertaken various countermeasures in response to these changes. Now, upon his election to the presidency in 2008, Barack Obama became the most visible representation of this political transformation that I mentioned, this demographic shift. So Obama became upfront in your face representation of the demographic changes that we are seeing in the US. And he was the manifestation of the success of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which made it difficult to prevent African Americans from voting and participating in politics after its passage. So shortly after the enactment of the Voting Rights Act, there was a dramatic increase in the number of Black voters and Black participants in the political process. And it led to a dramatic increase in the number of Blacks elected to public office and ultimately resulted in Barack Obama being elected president. Obama's election represented another notable transformation, and that is after the 2000 census, California became the second state after Hawaii to have a non-white majority population. A non-white majority population, California, largest state. Census projections at that time indicated that New Mexico and Texas would quickly follow suit, and indeed they did. By 2005, both states had transitioned to majority minority states. So by the time of Obama's election, it had become clear that the US was undergoing a demographic change that had the potential to reorder and reconfigure American politics in ways that were barely unimaginable just a few years ago, barely imaginable just a few years before. Most important among these changes was the census projections that whites would become a minority of the United States population by 2045. That whites would become a minority of the US population by 2045. Obama became the visible embodiment of a version of this saying that the demographics are destiny, which holds that population transformations would give rise to a powerful African-American and Latino-led rainbow coalition that would lead the Democratic Party to dominance in presidential elections and enhance Democratic Party political power in several states, and would ultimately result in more African-Americans and Latinos being elected at all levels of government. Social scientists had been thinking about and trying to track when this would happen, when these changes would happen. Some of you who might have heard me in earlier talk at the Academy, when Obama was running in 2008, I was there in person and predicted that he would lose. Many of us were surprised by how quickly the demographic transformation has happened. And at the time in 2008, there were very few who thought we would see Obama win at that time. But it happened, and because it happened, the Republican Party took notice of these demographic trends that I just described. There's evidence that this African-American and Latino-dominated rainbow coalition has emerged quicker than we thought, and that the coalition has the potential to radically change American politics. And this is why I think the Republican Party continues to do the things that it does on the political scene. And again, my point is that what Donald Trump has done and what he did and is continuing to do is not an aberration. It's a continuation of what the Republican Party and Republican operatives have done for some time now in politics. There are 24 states in the US in which the combined African-American and Latino voting age population is between 15 and 44% of the state's total voting population. 24 states in which the combined Black and Latino voting age population is between 15 and 44%. Now, I give you that statistic because that's significant. If you are 15 to 45% of a voting age population, that's some political influence in that state. These 24 states have a combined 365 electoral college votes. 95 more than is needed to win the presidency. Now, the Democratic Party candidate for president, the candidate supported by an overwhelming majority of Blacks and Latinos, won 11 of these 24 states in each of the past 3 election cycles, 2008, 2012, 2016. Now I can add 2020 to this. So the Democratic Party candidate for president won 11 of the 24 states with these significant numbers of Blacks and Latinos in the population in the last 4 presidential election cycles. 7 of these 11 states were designated as battleground states or swing states in each of the past 4 election cycles. Now, Barack Obama in 2008 won all of those states. And in 2012, during his re-election, won them all except one, my home state of North Carolina. Now, Obama's victory in Virginia and North Carolina in 2008 was the first time a Democratic candidate for president had carried those states in 42 and 44 years, respectively. Let me repeat that. So in 2008, when Obama won the states of Virginia and North Carolina, it was the first time that a Democratic Party candidate had won those states in 42 and 44 years, respectively. Also in 2008, Latino voters shifted away from the Republican Party in substantial numbers, which helped Obama to win in Colorado, Florida, Nevada, and New Mexico. African-American voters and Latino voters were factors in Hillary Clinton's failed presidential bid in 2016. Now, Clinton lost 8 of those 11 states, those battleground states, even though the Democratic Party nominee had won 7 of those, both in 2008 and 2012. So flip-flop, Clinton lost those states. It was not a shift to the Republican candidate by these voters that contributed to Clinton's defeat. Instead, as I mentioned before, it was unrealized potential in the form of lower African-American and Latino voter turnout. Lower African-American and Latino voter turnout in 2016 than there had been in 2012 and 2008. And again, my analysis is it's because Clinton didn't work for that vote. She assumed it and didn't ask for it and work for it. There's some evidence about this powerful coalition if you look at the 2018 election in this country. Right after the midterm election in 2018, now keep in mind, Trump's elected in 2016, midterm elections 2018. I'm invited to the University of Passau. It was the German-American Studies Association conference, and I gave an address there. And it was a few days after the election, and I gave some analysis and commentary on what had happened, at least what I thought had happened. And I think I titled the talk, The Voters Have Spoken, What Did They Say? And here are a couple of things that I said back in 2018 about that election. It was the highest midterm election turnout percentage-wise in the US since 1914. The highest percentage turnout in a midterm election in the US since 1914. 23 states had double-digit percentage point increases in voter turnout, 23 states, compared with their 1982 to 2014 midterm average. While there was increased voter turnout in support of Republican candidates, much of the increase in voter turnout in 2018 was due to the Democratic Party mobilizing various groups, in particular, African-American and Latino voters. An example of this turnout, increased turnout by African-Americans and Latinos. Latino turnout increased by 174% over 2014. So among the Latinos alone, an increase of 174% in 2018 over 2014. So the Democratic Party did a good job of mobilizing that vote that Hillary Clinton had left on the table when she ran in 2016. A second thing I highlighted in that talk is that the Democrats had a good night, on election night in 2018. As you know, the Democratic Party regained control over the House of Representatives in that election. They picked up 37 House seats. Nancy Pelosi became the Speaker of the House. The Democratic gains were historical, were good historical. There was what I would call a blue wave in that election. The Democrats flipped several former Republican stronghold seats in the suburbs of Philadelphia and Atlanta. Now, the Republicans gained in the US Senate in 2018, but that was not an unexpected outcome. The good news for the Democrats on the Senate side in 2018 is that they flipped Arizona from a Republican seat, one of the Senate seats from a Republican seat to a Democratic seat. And the Democrats came very close to defeating Texas Senator Ted Cruz, in Texas, a deep red Republican stronghold. But the Republicans got a scare in 2018 when Cruz came very close to being defeated. And I said in 2018 that Arizona and Texas must now be seen as competitive states for the 2020 presidential election. And that Republicans would have to spend lots of resources, precious resources and time in two states that they could not afford to lose, and two states that spent years not campaigning in presidential elections because they could always count them as an easy win. Fast forward to 2020, and we see what happened in those states. Arizona, Joe Biden wins. The states that Hillary lost, those blue wall Democratic states of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, Joe Biden wins. The biggest surprise in 2020 election, Biden wins the state of Georgia. Deep red state in the deep South, Joe Biden wins. Not only did Joe Biden win that race, the Democrats picked up both Senate seats in Georgia. And not only did they win both Senate seats, an African-American man won and a Jewish man won in a deep South, deep red state in 2020. The outcome in the 2020 election was due in part to this demographic shift that I described earlier, and that it gave the Democrats an advantage in key states. The growth of the Black and the brown populations in Arizona, Georgia, now Texas, has made the Democrats competitive in those states. And let me say, those are states that the Democrats didn't have to have and don't have to win in order to win the presidency. But those are states that the Republicans can't afford to lose. Now, I'm building up to say with all of these data that I just gave you, not only did the Democrats notice that they won, the Republicans noticed that they won. And what has been the response? It has been to do what the Republicans have done for several decades now. And that is to try to level the playing field, not by trying to convince more voters to support its policies and proposals, but trying to prevent the Democratic Party's supporters from participating in the political process. We have seen a number of efforts along these lines that include gerrymandering, and that is the manipulation of electoral districts for political advantage. And it is the use of the district drawing process to minimize or to curtail the voting power of Black and brown voters. And again, this is not new. This is something that we've seen in American politics since forever. Didn't start with Donald Trump. It won't end with Donald Trump. Gerrymandering has been a part of the process, but we've seen an intensified effort on the parts of Republicans to manipulate electoral districts in response to growing Black and brown political power. We've also seen an increased effort to pass restrictive voter ID laws. Forever in this country, you just show up to vote, you register, you show up, you show a driver's license, and in fact, you're not required to do that in most states until recently. You show up, your name's on the roll, you vote. After the election of Barack Obama in 2008, there was a nationwide effort on the parts of states to pass restrictive voter ID laws on the premise that there was fraud in elections. And I should say the evidence is that there is no such fraud. Research after research study has shown that there's no such fraud that voter ID laws would end. But nonetheless, states have undertaken efforts and have actually passed voter ID laws that require certain types of ID in order to vote in elections. It's thought, and there's been some court cases that have demonstrated that these efforts are an attempt to minimize and to weaken the support, the voting strength of Black and Latino voters. In my own state, North Carolina, it was a finding by the courts that the proponents of this legislation did research on what types of ID that Blacks were more likely to have or not have as they were putting together their proposal for voter ID. Another strategy that the Republican Party has used in response to its emerging Black and Brown voting coalition is the increased use of cultural politics, the dog whistles that I described early. Again, and keep in mind, it's preceded Donald Trump, and it will be after Donald Trump. Trump perfected it in some ways, and it was a master at using this strategy. But the use of cultural politics and race baiting in American politics is a long-standing practice that has been used and will continue to be used. Today, there's talk of critical race theory, which is, it's sort of laughable to me as an academic. And when I've asked folks, even my students, to tell me what critical race theory is, no one knows. But it's been used as a wedge issue for obvious reasons, critical and race. And people must assume it's something bad. You don't know what it is, but it must be bad. So that's, again, a continuation of a long-standing practice in American politics. Also, the Republicans are participating in, again, a long-standing practice of attacking political institutions and questioning the legitimacy of these institutions, not only legislatures around the country, but courts as well. And again, in the example I gave earlier, this is what Newt Gingrich and his colleagues did in attacking the very Congress in which they serve and the norms and practices of that institution. This is a continuation of a style of politics that has been common among Republicans for decades. The questioning of the outcomes of election is something that we've seen pop up. And it's popped up in a way that is somewhat new to question the outcome and the legitimacy of elections in the way that it happened in the last couple of election cycles. But let me point out that where it happened primarily is not a surprise, at least to me as a political observer who particularly watches trends in race and ethnic politics. These challenges were primarily in the precincts that were heavily populated by Black and Brown voters. Precincts in Arizona, where there's a large Latino population, Georgia, large Black population, Wisconsin, in the cities of Wisconsin, where there are large Black populations, and the same in Michigan. So questioning the outcome of elections and also questioning the legitimacy of the Black and Brown vote in those places. This didn't start with Trump. It preceded him by a long margin. and it won't end with Trump. Now, Joe Biden has now been elected. Does Biden represent a return to normalcy in American politics? It depends on what we mean by normalcy. Biden represents a return to normalcy in the sense that his election represents that old adage that I mentioned with regards to Barack Obama, that demographics may be destiny. Biden won the presidency because of the mobilization of this growing brown and Black political coalition, Black and Latino coalition. That coalition was mobilized and turned out in high numbers in the 2020 election. That's a return to normalcy if you go back to Barack Obama's elections in 2008 and 2012. I think 2016 was a fluke, and again, reflected more on what Hillary Clinton didn't do than what Donald Trump did do. So I think you see Biden, we can see Biden as a return to normalcy in terms of the trends in American politics. And I do believe that the trend is for this Black and brown coalition to be more influential in national election outcomes. And what do we see in this return to normalcy? We see the Republican Party intensifying its efforts that it's participated in for decades. Just this week, the US Justice Department sued the state of Texas because of its redistricting plans that it has passed, and sued the state and accused the state of racially gerrymandering, which is unconstitutional in the US. In Texas, between 2010 and 2020, there were 1 million new folks in Texas. The population grew by 1 million. 95% of that population growth was Black and brown voters, Black and brown people. So 95% Black and brown. When the state legislature, Republican-controlled legislature, drew electoral districts in Texas, you didn't see any increase in districts that would elect Black and brown officials, notwithstanding 1 million person increase, 95% of which Black or brown. They drew districts in a way that weakened and lessened the representation that Blacks and browns would likely have in the next election cycle. That's a persistent pattern that we see all over the country, and it's in response to this demographic shift that we begin to see in a real way when Obama was elected. And I think Donald Trump manipulated that process. He understood it in ways that gave him some advantages, but it wasn't new what he did. It was a continuation. So I will stop with that and just close by saying that the trends in American politics in the future will be continued increase in the Black and brown vote and political power in key places where Republicans know they can't afford to lose. Georgia being one place. Texas, watch Texas in next year's midterm elections. The Republicans are working hard to make it less likely to happen, but the Democratic Party is poised to pick up some congressional seats and perhaps the governor's seat in Texas. My own state of North Carolina is trending blue. Again, the Black and brown population growing relative to the white population. Those voters still now support Democratic candidates more than Republicans, and that's leading to North Carolina becoming much more competitive in years past. And so you'll see that trend continue in American politics, but unfortunately, I think we'll see the trend of racially divisive politics and practices continue as well. I will stop now and take questions, and let's have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Haynie, for this engaging talk and for your wide-ranging contextualization of where we are now. I think this is very helpful to see the longer narrative of what is happening with both parties and what is happening with demographics in the United States. I want to encourage our viewers to post their questions, send them through the chat or via email, and we will take them up here in our little conversation. So the first questions have come in, and I want to start by going back to the beginning of your talk when you started to speak about Newt Gingrich. I think that seems to have hit a nerve with many of our viewers and the way that he created this new rhetoric, this very divisive rhetoric in terms of political style. Now, when we contrast this divisive rhetoric to Biden's tactic throughout his campaign and his emphasis on pointing to his record of bipartisanship, of working across the aisle, and of also indicating that he would do that in the future, we may wonder, he had this record on being friends or colleagues with McCain. We've just this week have seen his speech at the funeral of Bob Dole, where again, he made that point. Where do you see this strategy going? Has it really played out in favor of Biden? Biden's popularity or Biden's sort of agency in negotiating deals? Is it something that we can say is a counter model to the divisiveness? Because I think one thing that this strategy tried to do was to say that Trump is an aberration, and we can work across the aisle with other Republicans, just not with this one. So, what is your take on this?
Yes, that's a very good question. So I think it remains to be seen. I mean, Biden was the perfect candidate for the Democrats for just this very reason, right? That he could harken back to a time where politics wasn't as divisive, that there was some working across the aisles. And I think that played well. But what we see actually happening now, right? He's having a tough time with his own party, trying to get agreement, and certainly working across the aisle is not working out. Because there are a number of Republicans who have been elected, who've been around for some time now, and surprisingly so to me, who I think misread what Trump meant, right? They thought Trump was, again, something new and an aberration and something that would be lasting. And they moved to embrace Trump and to put themselves in his corner and not do the politics that they had done before. Many longstanding members who had been a part of that generation of Biden when he was a member of the Senate, and Bob Dole, folks who are around now who have taken extreme positions, Mitch McConnell himself being the majority leader of the Senate, front and center in this, to break the institution. It remains to be seen how long this will last and whether it would benefit the Republicans in the long run. I think not. I think we're beginning to see cracks in that strategy in terms of its effectiveness as the Democratic Party is able to fashion some victories. I think there are folks out, voters and constituents have tired of the divisive language and the practice of politics. And I think we have seen in recent elections, Trump didn't do so well in terms of candidates he endorsed, that there were candidates who ran away from Trump and won, Republicans who ran away from Trump and won, some he endorsed lost. So I think that we'll know more in 2022, next year elections as to what happened, because we see Trump out there endorsing Republican candidates against incumbent Republicans and endorsing all manner of candidates, and we'll see how they turn out. I think the winds will shift after 2022, and we'll get back to a style of politics that Joe Biden promotes, and that will advantage him and the Democratic Party in 2024. I don't know Biden to be on the top of the ticket, but it advantages the Democratic Party if they could get back to a politics where there's working across the aisle.
Thank you. The next question is about, again, Gingrich tactics, which worked well with the press, as you mentioned. The question then continues, I believe this could also be assumed for Trump's antics, that they worked well with the press. And would you, Professor Haynie, agree that one of the reasons for the political turmoil of the last couple of years is also the growing dysfunctionality of the traditional press and media, which pays more attention to salability than serious political discourse?
I certainly think that's part of it. I do think the press contributes to the dysfunction in American politics by what they choose to cover and how they choose to cover it and what they choose not to cover. I certainly think that plays into it. But it's also something with Americans, people and the American culture that is a part of this as well. And, and the Republicans touch on something in this style of politics that's a potential positive. And the Democrats tend not to do this. And what I mean by this is, for most ordinary citizens, politics is an emotional engagement and not a mental or academic one. So Democratic candidates, go to give a lecture that I would give in my class at the university about policy positions. Republicans tend to speak in language that appeals to the sensibilities and the emotions of ordinary people. And they can understand the issues that way. And they manipulate and take it to an extreme. And I think that, I think, misuse voters in that way. But the Democrats could learn a lesson by talking in terms and in ways that ordinary people understand politics. It is not trying to tell me what the debt ceiling is and how many billions and what we have. It's about what do voters get from the policies and why the importance of what you're doing, why you're doing it is important, and being able to explain that in ordinary language. Bill Clinton was a master at that, charismatic, straight talk, could boil something very sophisticated down to simple terms that voters can understand. And it's not an accident that Bill Clinton's a Southerner. And that Southern charisma that we see folks use for what I would call bad purposes, right? Manipulating emotions in a negative way. Clinton did it on the other side, right? Appealing emotionally to folks to get them to understand and to feel passionate about an issue is something that's important. So the strategy that Gingrich and others have used is well founded in some psychological research. But again, I think they have manipulated folks to their own selfish ends and purposes.
Let's have the next question. Thank you for your very insightful talk. You indicated that Trump was not an aberration, but a symptom of a longer trend in the Republican Party started by Gingrich. Would you say that the way the Democrats embraced neoliberal ideology from Bill Clinton onwards also played a role in Clinton's loss and Trump's rise? So could one assume that there is a history to the current situation actually on both sides of the political aisle?
First, let me say that, this didn't start with Gingrich. I mean, I use that as an example of a long-standing trend. And so I started there, but this trend started well before Gingrich and his crowd. I do think that there are lessons that the Democratic Party has to learn as well. And one mistake the Democrats have made is to be out of touch with where the American public is. In terms of, this is a moderate country. It's not to the far left as the Democratic Party and some of its candidates want to be and have pushed the party to be. That's not the case in terms of where we are as a country as a whole in a national sense. And we've never been there. And I don't think we'll ever be to the left as far left as some in the Democratic Party imagines the party to be. Again, another reason why I think Joe Biden was able to win. And again, let me also say that the Black and brown voters that I have spoken about are not to the far left as well. For the most part, Black and brown voters are moderate voters, and in fact, in some ways, conservative when it comes to some social issues. So some elected officials who are elected in discrete electoral districts or a particular state, they oversell or overinterpret their election, and to think that what they think and how they ran a campaign would work in other places. If you look at the Democratic Party now with Senator Manchin from West Virginia, who is seen as an obstructionist, well, what do the Democrats expect a Democrat from West Virginia to be, right? Other than a moderate Democrat, if he's going to win in that state, he can't be a Democrat from Massachusetts or New York or California. He's a Democrat from West Virginia. And that's the lesson that I think the Democrats are missing when they run national campaigns, is that you have to be where the people are if you're going to win, or be very good at making a compelling case for why the people should be where you want them to be, and they haven't been so good at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And I think the next question that we have is really fitting to exactly this topic, because one person is asking you, isn't it much harder for Democrats to mobilize their voter base, since their voter base is very diverse, from left-leaning Sanders fans to often socially conservative Latinos and so forth? In Florida, Trump won in 2020 with the help of Latino votes. How can Democrats make sure that they mobilize all their potential voters in the future?
Yes, that's been the perennial problem for the Democratic Party since the 1960s, right? To have this expansive, very diverse constituency and trying to fashion campaigns that are winnable. And there's a way to do it. I mean, so the way to do it is to realize and understand that, you know, in the US politics, presidential elections are not national campaigns. I mean, they're presented as national campaigns. The media covers them as national campaigns, but they're state by state races. You have to win in, you know, a number of states in order to win. So you have to run a state by state campaign. And so to have national platforms that only matter for media consumption, but to have candidates who are willing to run a campaign state by state, and you don't have different messages for each state, but you fashion your message and the appeal that will work and convince voters in that state to come out and vote for you. Now, the Republicans are going to face this as well as they attempt to grow their party. It's going to mean you have to widen the tent and who's in that tent. And then you have that problem also. How do you manage and maintain support among these folks who have different views? Now, the Democrats used to be good at this, where you would agree to win on some issues and lose on some issues. So you compromise as to what the agenda would be. And now there's, in the sense of the country as a whole, this sense that politics is that I win everything I want, or I don't play at all. And we've seen this among Democrats in recent months and years, that the idea is if I don't win everything I want, then I don't play. That's never been how politics work in this country, and politics can't work that way. And certainly for the Democrats, it won't be successful if that's the strategy, as opposed to compromising amongst yourselves and being able to fashion a message about that compromise that you take out on the road.
Mm-hmm. In terms of changing demographics and diversity, which are both topics that you've worked extensively on, the current president has tried to create a cabinet that sort of reflects what the country looks like. And he's said that many times. Now, in terms of what you see as the reactions to that cabinet, certainly some of those cabinet members are more popular than others. Some have also become quite unpopular. And do you see that voters find this sort of just a kind of a merely symbolic thing, or do they see really a different form of representation in such a cabinet that is more based on diversity?
I think voters pay little attention to cabinet officials. In the sense that, the last point you made, that it symbolizes a sense that they're being represented when they see someone who looks like them in a cabinet position. But beyond that, I don't think voters pay attention to how effective a cabinet member is or not. I think that's a media game, an inside Washington game. I think the bloodying up or nastying up of candidate or nominees has become political sport, and often has very little to do with the expertise or the qualifications of the candidate. It's a way for political parties to gain points over the other by refusing to confirm cabinet chores or going after a cabinet member over some particular issue. It's become political sport. It has often very little to do with the qualifications. I don't think it matters that much to the public who these people are beyond seeing someone who looks like them is something that can be a motivating factor for politics. But beyond that, I don't think they pay much attention at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Next question. You outlined a continuity in Republican politics, starting with Gingrich and culminating in Trump. Do you think, and I think you touched on this a little already, do you think this programmatic orientation will simply be extended in and through the next elections? Do you see a reorientation on the Republican horizon? Maybe I'll just add another question to that, because it fits quite nicely here. Another question also asks, how far Trump's presidency can also be seen as a form of catharsis that brought the fractures and frictures of American society to the fore. The lingering racism, right-wing extremism, and ideological cults of a nostalgic conservatism that surprised a lot of people in Europe and maybe even in the US. However, it also pointed to those neuralgic points which have to be addressed if democracy will continue to work in the US. Do you agree? So these are two questions, talking about the current moment and what to expect.
Yeah, I certainly agree with the last question, that what the Trump presidency did was to wake up quite a few folks in this country who on all dimensions across the spectrum, people of color, Black and brown people, had assumed now that we had made quite a bit of progress, and we have. So no denying the progress this country's made in terms of race and ethnicity over the last 50, 60 years. My daughter, who's 19 years old, her life is night and day 1,000 times different than mine or my mother. And so there have been significant changes. But what happened during the Trump years, I think woke people up to say that we can't take it for granted. And one thing that should disturb Republicans that happened, I think, among my daughter's generation and younger folks, this is something that was foreign to them. I'm 58 years old. When I started grade one in public schools here in North Carolina in 1969, and my grade one year was the first year in my hometown that schools were fully integrated. Mm. My brother, who's a year older, 59, started school in 1968, went to an all-Black first grade year. Year one was all Black, and mine was always integrated. So it hadn't been that long ago. But my daughter, and even folks younger, a little bit older than her, all they know is an integrated society and diversity and differences in ways that I'm still having to catch up to, right? In terms of sexual orientation and identity kinds of issues. This is second heck to them. So the dog whistles don't play well with this generation, is the point. The old long-standing practice of race baiting, dog whistles, and fear-mongering doesn't play well with younger people for the most part. They react in a negative sense to that. They don't understand it. They have gay and lesbian friends. Just so what? They're just my friends. I mean, so and to see these attacks and the denigration of folks doesn't play well. That's a caution for Republicans, and you see in terms of voter support, they are losing younger voters, and I think that's in part because of the way they practice politics. I do think there are some potential changes on the horizon. We're beginning to see now members of Congress, there are those who voted for impeachment the second time, those who have insisted that there be some accountability for what happened at the US Capitol on January 6th of 2020, that there be some accountability and for that. And that's beginning to pick up some traction outside of Washington among Republicans and other places. So I do think there's a potential to have the Republican Party change or revert back. I think what's likely to happen is that we won't have a Republican Party. There may be more than one. So I don't know how the two factions can coexist, but I do see the reemergence of the more traditional wing of that party with the commentaries folks are writing, some of the stances and positions people are taking, even Mitch McConnell himself in the way that he's now governing the Senate and managing the Senate on his side, where he's reaching across the aisle now and compromising with the Democrats. It's signaling a change, I think, that we may see in party politics, especially among the Republicans.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Following up, there is a question regarding specifically Black voters who seem to be very disappointed. Now, how do you think they will vote next year? Or maybe phrased differently, how can Biden win back their support?
Yeah, so I think you have to start with this. I mean, Black voters are not going to go to the Republican Party as it's constituted now in the politics they practice. The question for Biden is, can he get them out in support of him and other Democrats? So I think the political allegiance is not in question. The enthusiasm and whether they'll get out and vote might be in question. So the Biden campaign and the Democrats in general would have to fashion a strategy to get Black voters out in large numbers in order to be successful in the 2022 campaign and 2024. What's working in Biden's favor and the Democrats' favor, I think, is that Donald Trump is still present on the scene. Donald Trump is a motivating force for minority voters, especially African-American, Latino voters. So as long as he stays around and is active and prominent, folks are going to be motivated to come out and turn out to vote against the Trump-type politics. So that's in Biden's favor. But they're going to have to be proactive in turning out that vote and getting it to the polls. And especially now, since the Republicans have been somewhat successful in some of the states at putting barriers in place for voters. Again, I mentioned restrictive ID laws that will hurt some voters. Not only that, they reduce the amount of hours that the polls are open, right? So a man like me, a professor, right, I can leave campus and go vote almost any time of the day. If you have a 9-to-5 job, you're restricted as to when you can go vote. And it matters for ordinary folks if the polls are not open extended hours that allow you to vote. And, let alone you have to leave your job, go home and take care of a family and kids, and then try to vote. So those restrictions are going to hurt, and the Democrats have to figure out how to overcome some of the hurdles that Republicans have put in place to hurt their voters. So it's a big challenge, but I think it's not insurmountable, and especially as Trump stays on the scene. I think Republicans are wishing that Trump would, move away and move to the background and stay on the golf course and not the political campaign trail.
Mm. There was a change of government in Germany this week, actually, and it was interesting to see that many of the media commentators actually appreciated sort of the smooth transition, and handshakes and flowers were given, and there were like some ceremonies, but it was mostly low key. And many of them referred to January 6th in the United States, saying, we know that this is not something that we can take for granted, and so we're happy this is the way it went. And you mentioned the sort of legal side, or the way that the US are still wrestling with the consequences of the January 6th happenings. So for many transatlantic viewers, this was quite a spectacle, and it was also quite scary. So can you say a bit more on where you see this going, also with regard to groups that are not bowing to the election result? And so there seems to be a lot happening that may not always be visible to us in social media channels, in other sort of dark forums. And do you perceive this as a continuing threat to the system?
I think it remains to be seen. I think we don't fully understand how what happened actually happened. It's no mystery that these elements and some of the groups who showed up on the 6th are out there and are willing and able to create havoc and participate in violence. What the big question that remains to be answered and understood is, how did all of these folks from all over the country get to this particular place on this particular day at this particular time? And that's going to tell us quite a bit about what happened. And it had to be some organizing effort that was pretty extensive to coordinate this. We know about something about social media and the effects that is having on politics, and the ability of folks to get misinformation, wrong information, and manipulating information. I think that's a part of it. We don't fully understand yet what happened. So once that becomes clear as to what happened and how it happened, in the sense of how these folks from all corners of the country got to this place at the same time, once we understand that, we'll know more about what it means in terms of continuing threat. Now, having said that, I have long thought that just beneath the surface, we have these elements that pose this type of risk to our democracy. That, things are, you find these pockets in various places around the country, and those can easily be manipulated to create the kind of havoc that we saw on January 6th. From time to time, you'll see things happening on military bases where you have these white supremacist groups would organize and do things, or in various places around the country. We'll see things flare up. So that is always beneath the surface and not too far beneath the surface. But whether or not what we saw on January 6th could happen again is frightening to think that it can. I'm not so sure how it happened that time. And once we know more about that, I think we can say more about the potential threat that's out there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Professor Haynie, I have one last question for you, if that's okay.
Yes.
So the question is, given the strong and deep polarization of the political parties, do you think that this development might result in the demise of the two-party system in the long run? So this question, I think, is a classic. And I think that also with regard to our sense, our sort of transatlantic perspective on US democracy, we may think of a number of sort of anachronisms, for lack of a better word. Let me label them anachronisms. So one of them certainly is the two-party system. And I'm afraid I know what you're going to answer, but I turn it over to you nonetheless.
Yeah.
So please.
Yeah. The very structure of our system, it means that the two-party system is here to stay. These winner-take-all elections, right? And the way the system is structured means the two-party system is not going away anytime soon. What is happening, and it's interesting to watch, and not sure quite what to make of it. If you look at, I know in this state of North Carolina, I was looking at some national data a day ago, that the Democrats and Republicans the parties are beginning to shrink in terms of the number and percentages of voters who identify as Democrats and Republicans. And the largest increase have been among folks who say they're independent, right? And so that's as close as we're going to get to a third party that's viable in national. Like that, you have unaffiliated voters, is what they're called, or independents. And we're beginning to see voters, I think, in response to the polarized politics and the lack of engaged and the old debate and compromise that once characterized politics in this country. You win some, you lose some, where it's sort of, we don't even now play the same game and talk the same language about the same set of facts, that folks are beginning not to identify with either and see themselves as unaffiliated. And I think the parties have to contend with what that means in the long run. I know in North Carolina, it's so surprising that the largest percentage of voters who are registered or who identify as unaffiliated, and that's a trend around the country. So the two-party system is not going anywhere, but the way that voters participate in politics is certainly changing, and it may be less partisan in ways that it once was in the past, meaning that you may register as a Democrat, but you may vote for others. You may not even register now as a Democrat. You register as unaffiliated, and then you cast your vote either way. And how the parties organize and strategize around that is going to be difficult to figure out. But it certainly is an issue that the parties would have to contend. Let me close by saying I think the parties can certainly transform themselves, and I think there's some evidence that may be happening. Certainly, as I mentioned before, with the Republican Party, that there are elements who think there are ways to transform and change the party, and losing elections has a way of making that happen with a quicker timetable.
Yeah. Thank you for your closing words. Time has gone by very quickly in conversation with you, even though the sun in your background doesn't seem to go up or down at all. Our time is up. Again, thank you on behalf of the BAA for your lecture and for being in conversation with all of us. I think we will talk again, maybe after the midterms next year or so.
Let's do.
In a time for another analysis, and we'll see how that goes. And so have a great afternoon in Durham, and we'll see each other again soon. And thanks for coming out to all of the people in the audience. Good night, good evening, and goodbye.
Thank you very much for having me, and good evening.